The doctor knelt beside the cot and lifted the child's eyelid with his thumb. The tent smelled of heated canvas and warm iron. The stove had been cold for weeks, but the metal still held every degree the sun pressed through the walls. A cracked blue basin sat on the floor with 2 inches of water gone tepid. The girl's mother stood in the doorway, one hand on the baby at her hip, the other gripping the tent pole as if the whole structure might shift. Outside, not a single shadow fell from anything taller than the pole she held. The doctor folded a piece of paper, wrote a single line, and held it out. He said to take it seriously before it became a different kind of document. In April of 1895, a man named Milo Wardell drove a borrowed wagon across the county line into Wallace County, Kansas, with a woman, 3 children, 1 mare, a canvas wall tent, and a conviction that wheat would pay for lumber before the first frost. He was 34 years old. He had worked 6 years as a ditch hand for the Kansas Pacific Rail Line, grading embankments and cutting drainage channels through clay and limestone in every kind of weather. He knew how to move dirt. He did not know how to build a house from it. Clara sat beside him with Lottie asleep in the crook of her arm. Ruth and Orrin rode in the wagon bed behind them, wedged between a cast-iron stove, 2 water barrels, a crate of kitchen tools, and a roll of canvas so heavy it had taken both Milo and the freight agent to load it. That canvas was the family shelter. A 12 by 16-foot wall tent, military surplus, double-seamed at the ridge but patched twice at the base where mice had chewed through during storage. Milo had paid $9 for it in Topeka. He told Clara it would last 6 weeks, maybe 8. By then the wheat money would come, and the lumber order would ship from Hayes, and he would frame a proper house with a porch facing east and a root cellar dug into the draw. The wheat money never came. The first season scorched short. Rain fell twice in May, once in June, and not again until September, when it arrived as a hailstorm that shredded the young shoots flat. Milo replanted what he could. The second planting yellowed and curled in July heat. By October, he had harvested 11 bushels from 160 acres. 11 bushels. Not enough to pay for seed, let alone lumber. He wrote to Clara's brother Emmett in Topeka. Emmett had a clerk's job at a land office and had promised a loan, $50 for framing timber, nails, and roofing. The letter went out in November. The reply came in January, but not from Emmett. Emmett's wife wrote that he had died of pneumonia the week after Christmas. There was no money. There was no estate. There was a funeral debt and 3 children of her own. Clara read the letter at the table being a plank across 2 flour barrels inside the tent. She folded it once and set it beside her coffee tin and said nothing for a long time. Lottie pulled at her skirt. Outside, the wind dragged grit across the canvas, and the tent ropes hummed like something alive. That letter killed the lumber order. It killed the frame house. It killed passage back east, because Emmett had also been their only family with room enough to take them in. Milo had spent his filing fee, his savings, and a year of labor. If he abandoned the claim now, he lost the fee, the improvements. The well he had dug 22 feet into limestone and chalk, and the only piece of ground in the world with his name on it. There was nowhere to go and no money to go there with. By May of 1896, the tent that was supposed to last 6 weeks had become the family's only shelter for 13 months. The canvas had gone from white to the color of old bone. The southwest corner sagged where a support pole had split in a windstorm. Milo had patched it with a strip of flour sack and a smear of pine tar he scraped from a shipping crate, and the patch held. But the whole structure leaned now, as if the tent itself was tired. Inside, in the middle of the day, the air did not move. The canvas trapped heat the way a closed hand traps a coal. The iron stove, which Milo had let go cold in April, still radiated warmth from its black surface because the sun struck the tent wall behind it, and the metal remembered every degree. Clara hung a wet cloth over the ridgepole. It dried in 40 minutes. She hung another. The children lay on the dirt floor because the dirt was cooler than the cots. Ruth, 7 years old, had begun to faint. The first time it happened, she was carrying a half bucket of water from the well. She set the bucket down, sat beside it, and went sideways into the dirt without a sound. Clara found her with her cheek against the ground, and her fingers still curled around the bale handle. She was breathing. Her skin was hot and dry. Clara carried her inside, wet her face and wrists, and did not sleep that night. The second time, Ruth collapsed beside the water barrel in the tent's shade, and this time she vomited before she went down. Clara sent word to Dr. Emery Vale through a mail carrier who passed the claim every Thursday. Vale came on a Saturday. He was 61, a former Army surgeon who had set bones at Fort Dodge and cut gangrene from infantry legs on the southern plains. He had retired to Sharon Springs, 18 miles east, where he served as county physician, coroner, and the only medical authority within a day's ride. He arrived on a gray gelding with his bag across the saddle horn and his hat pulled low against the white sky. He did not greet Milo. He stepped past him and ducked into the tent. Inside, Vale knelt beside Ruth's cot. He lifted her eyelid with his thumb. He pressed 2 fingers to the underside of her wrist and counted against his pocket watch. He touched her forehead, her neck, the hollow of her throat. Then he stood and turned in a slow circle, taking inventory the way a man surveys a battlefield. The tent, 12 by 16 feet, 4 bodies sleeping, eating, breathing in a space smaller than a freight car. The canvas walls catching every degree of sun and holding it. The iron stove cold, but still warm to the touch. 2 water barrels, one 3/4 full, the other sweating and half empty. A cracked blue basin with 2 inches of warm water. No shade tree within a 1/4 mile. No ice within 40 miles. 1 well, 22 feet deep, its flow already slowing as the water table dropped. Vale turned to Milo. His voice was flat, the voice of a man who had written too many death certificates to soften his words. "How long has the child been symptomatic?" 2 weeks, Clara said from the doorway. "Maybe 3. The fainting started 2 weeks ago. The vomiting is new." Vale nodded. "Heat prostration, the mild kind so far. The next stage is when she stops sweating. After that, the brain swells." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "Canvas is not shelter in this weather. It is a lantern chimney with people inside it." "I know what it is," Milo said. "Then you know you cannot keep 3 children in it through July and August." Vale reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He wrote something on it, a single line, and held it out. "This says heat prostration. Take it seriously before it becomes a death certificate." Milo took the paper. His hand was steady, but his jaw was tight. Vale stepped outside and looked at the claim. The tent, the well, the mare standing head down beside the wagon, the flat, treeless prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction, shimmering with heat. Not a single structure taller than the tent pole. "Build a frame house," Vale said, "or move into town." "I cannot afford lumber," Milo said, "and town means Klein's back shed. Klein wants my claim." "Then build a soddy. People have done it." "A sod house takes 3 men, 6 weeks, and roof timber I do not have." "Then you are describing a dead end, Wardell." Vale swung into his saddle. "And your daughter is standing in the middle of it." He rode east into the white heat without looking back. Milo stood beside the tent for a long time after Vale left. Clara did not come out. He could hear Lottie fussing inside, and Clara's voice, low and steady, trying to keep the baby calm. Ruth was quiet. That was worse than crying. He counted what he had. $11.60 in coin. One mare, 8 years old, sound but losing condition on poor grass and shallow water. A breaking plow with a dull share. A slip scraper borrowed from a neighbor's barn and not yet returned. 2 water barrels. A wall tent that was killing his children. He counted what he needed. Lumber. $40 minimum for a one-room frame, and that assumed Milo did the labor alone. Sod house help. 2 men at $1 a day each for 3 weeks, plus ridge timber and window frames. We call it $35 he did not have, and 3 weeks he could not spare. Passage to Topeka. $18 for the family, assuming someone would take the claim and livestock as partial payment, which meant losing everything. Every calculation ended at the same wall. That night, after the children were down, Milo walked outside. The air had cooled, but only from unbearable to merely punishing. The sky was a dark bowl of stars, and the prairie was silent, except for a nighthawk somewhere in the draw. He walked to the place where Nell stood, head low, her hoof pawing the dirt the way she did when flies bothered her. He looked down. Nell had scraped the surface soil aside, and the exposed subsoil beneath was a different color, paler, denser, slightly damp. Milo crouched and pressed his palm to it. The surface dirt was still warm from the day, but the exposed clay 2 inches down was cooler, not cold, not comfortable, but measurably, undeniably cooler than anything above it. He held his hand there for a long time. The clue did not become an idea for 3 more days. It came through Ruth. She had taken to crawling under the wagon at noon because the strip of shade there held a pocket of air that was less murderous than the tent. Clara scolded her the first time. The axle was low, and the ground was dirty, and a child should not be lying in the dust like a dog. But then Clara knelt and felt the ground where Ruth had been lying. Packed dirt, shaded by the wagon bed, untouched by direct sun since morning. It was cool enough that the difference was startling. Clara looked at Milo. He was watching from the tent flap, and the same memory was moving through him. His father's hand, years ago, gripping his wrist and pressing his boyhood palm against the cut bank of a railroad embankment. The shaded side, where the grade crew had sliced into the hill, cool clay under his fingernails, the smell of tar from the rail ties above, and the sound of cicadas throbbing in the ditch grass. His father's voice, "The sun only owns the skin of the earth. 2 feet down, it does not know what season it is." Milo walked to the draw that crossed the southeast corner of his claim. The draw was shallow, 6 feet deep at its lowest, with sloped banks of packed clay and chalk. He stepped down into it and pressed his hand to the bank wall at waist height. Cool. Not cave cool, not cellar cold, but distinctly cooler than the air above his head. He dug his fingers into the bank and pulled out a handful of clay. It was damp. Not wet, damp. Soil that had not felt the sun in days, maybe weeks. He stood in the draw and looked back at the tent, white and blazing on the flat ground, and the idea took shape, not as a finished plan, as a question. If he could not build walls up, no lumber, no time, no help, could he bring earth against what he already had? The tent was failing because canvas caught heat and held it. But what if the lower walls were not canvas anymore? What if they were buried in mass, packed dirt, cut sod, the same material that kept the drawbank cool? If the air at floor level could be drawn from a shaded trench instead of the open prairie, it might enter cooler than the blast outside. He thought like a ditch hand, not an architect. He had graded embankments for 6 years. He knew how soil behaved when piled, when packed, when wet, when dry. He knew that a berm held its shape if the base was wide enough. He knew that a drainage notch kept water from pooling. He knew that a scraper could move earth faster than a shovel, and that Nell could pull a scraper if the ground was not too hard. The first design was crude. Dig a trench 3 feet deep around the tent. Throw the spoil against the canvas walls. Shade the top with feed sacks. Simple, fast, maybe fast enough. He started the next morning before dawn. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he had cut a line 2 feet deep along the north wall of the tent. The spoil went against the canvas in a rough pile. It looked like a man burying his own house. It looked like madness. By noon, the pile had slumped. The dry, loose soil could not hold its own weight against the tent wall. It bowed the canvas inward, pressing against the support poles, tilting the ridgepole off its seating. Clara heard the wood creak and looked up. The ridge shifted 2 inches to the south. The north wall bulged like a sail filling with wind. "Out," Clara said. She did not raise her voice. She picked up Lottie and took Ruth by the hand and walked the children into the open air. Orrin followed, clutching a wooden horse Milo had carved from a scrap of cottonwood. The ridgepole held, but the design had failed. Milo was standing in his half-dug trench, breathing hard, coated in dust, when Reuben Height rode up. Reuben was 42, a neighboring settler whose claim lay 4 miles east. He was a thick, careful man who had come to Kansas from Missouri with more sense than ambition, and he had managed to raise a frame lean-to by buying discount lumber from a rail salvage lot. He was not unkind. He was practical in the way that practical men sometimes use as a substitute for imagination. He looked at the slumped earth, the tilted tent, the trench, and Milo standing in it with a shovel. "What are you building?" Reuben asked. "I'm banking earth against the tent walls. The soil below grade is cooler. If I can mass it against the canvas and shade it, the inside temperature drops." Reuben dismounted and helped Milo lift the ridgepole back into its seating. They braced it with a length of scrap lumber wedged against a stone. Then Reuben stepped back and looked at the wreckage of the morning's work. "Milo," he said, "you're spending your strength making a mud oven." "It is not mud. It is packed earth. There is a difference." "The difference is the word you use. Dirt holds heat. You know that. You have felt a sod wall in August. It is warm clear through." A sod wall in August is warm because it is exposed to sun on the outside. If the mass is shaded and the outside face is protected, the interior temperature stays closer to ground level. The drawbank is 20 degrees cooler than the surface right now. I measured it with my hand. "You measured it with your hand." Reuben was not mocking him. He was stating a fact. The measurement was not a measurement. It was a feeling. "And what about snakes? You dig a trench around your tent. You're building a highway for rattlers. What about rain? One good storm fills that trench and floods your floor. What about the weight? You saw what happened. The soil pushed your tent in." "Because I piled it wrong. The soil cannot press against canvas directly. It needs a retaining course, sod blocks, planks, something to hold the face. And the trench has to be outside the berm, not under the wall. I built it wrong, Reuben. That does not mean the idea is wrong." Reuben looked at the tent. He looked at the trench. He looked at Milo's hands, which were already blistered across both palms from the shovel handle. "How many days of this can you do before you drop?" "As many as it takes." "And if it does not work?" Milo did not answer that. Reuben mounted his horse. I mean no insult, but a man should know when a job is too big for one pair of hands. You should be hauling water and moving your family into town. There's no shame in it. He rode east. Milo watched him go. Then he looked at the slumped earth in the tilted tent and began revising the design in his head. The trench could not be directly under the tent wall. It had to be outside, separated by the berm. The berm had to lean against a retaining face. Sod blocks cut with the root mat intact stacked grass side down so the roots locked together. The lower canvas had to be shielded by scrap planks and woven grass mats so the soil never pressed the fabric directly. And the whole structure needed two things the first attempt lacked: intake gaps near the trench bottom where cooler air could enter, and a vent at the tent ridge where hot air could escape. Not a pile, a rampart. He drew it in the dirt with a stick, working out dimensions. A rectangular trench 20 feet by 24 feet, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide at the bottom, sloped wider at the top. The excavated soil packed into a berm 3 feet high and 4 feet thick at the base. Sod blocks forming the outer skin, scrap planks, and willow brush on the inner face. 2 low intake gaps on the north and east sides. A ridge flap propped open on the south for venting. The design was plausible. It was also enormous. He calculated the volume of earth to be moved, roughly 120 cubic yards. With Nell and the slip scraper working in the cool hours before sunrise and after sunset, he might move 8 to 10 yards a day. That was 12 to 15 days of labor, assuming no breakdowns, no illness, no interference. 15 days in which the tent would still be an oven, and Ruth would still be sick, and every dollar Milo had would keep draining toward water and food. He needed the slip scraper. The one he had was borrowed, sitting behind Reuben's barn, technically, but Reuben had waved him toward it months ago. For the volume of work ahead, he needed a bigger one, and the only bigger scraper within reach belonged to the livery behind Klein's store in Sharon Springs. Milo rode Nell to town the next morning. The ride took 3 hours in the heat. Sharon Springs was a cluster of frame buildings along the road. Tracy E., Klein's general store and lumber office, a feedlot, a blacksmith, the livery, 2 saloons, and a scattering of houses and sheds that passed for a town. The store was the largest building. Klein had built it himself 5 years earlier with lumber he sold to himself at cost, and he had tarred the roof flat and painted the false front white, and it stood on the main road like a man with his arms crossed. Jasper Klein was on the porch when Milo rode up. Klein was 48. He had come to Wallace County a decade earlier, not to farm, but to sell to farmers. He ran the store, the lumber agency, and a quiet side business in claim speculation. When homesteaders failed, and most did, Klein bought their quit claims for back debts and filing fees, accumulated the land, and held it for resale to cattle outfits and road contractors. He was patient about it. He did not need to push anyone off their land. The prairie did that. He just had to be standing there with the paperwork when they fell. Milo's claim interested him for a specific reason. The shallow draw that crossed the southeast corner was where freight teams already cut across on the road, traced between Sharon Springs and the rail spur to the south. If that road trace ever formalized, the land around the crossing would be worth 10 times what Milo had paid in filing fees. Klein had made this calculation. Milo had not. "Wardell," Klein said. "I heard Vale rode out to your place." "He did. And?" "My daughter has heat sickness. I need the slip scraper behind the livery, the big one with the iron edge." Klein's eyebrows went up. "What do you need a scraper for?" "Earthwork." "Earthwork." Klein let the words sit. 2 men on the porch, a freight hand and a fence contractor, were listening. "You building something out there?" "I am banking earth against my tent. To cool it." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the freight hand laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a confused one. The fence contractor shook his head slowly. Klein smiled. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed information he can use. "I will loan you the scraper," he said. $2 for the week, payable whether you succeed or not. If the tool comes back damaged, the mare is collateral. $2 for a scraper that sits behind your livery collecting rust. It is my scraper and my price. Take it or leave it. Milo took it. He had no choice. $2 was almost a fifth of everything he had, but without the scraper, the Rampart would take a month with a shovel alone, and Ruth did not have a month. As Milo led Nell around back to hitch the scraper, Klein turned to the men on the porch and said, loud enough to carry, "Wardell is digging a grave around his own tent and calling it a house." The men laughed. The freight hand repeated it to someone inside the store. By evening, the line had traveled to the feed lot, the blacksmith, and the pump. By the next morning, it had reached every claim within 10 miles. The gossip arrived before Milo finished his first trench section. A woman at the town pump told Clara's name to another woman and said someone should take those children into town before their father buried them alive. The words reached Clara through the mail carrier, who repeated them with an apologetic shrug and a sideways look at the half-dug trench. Reuben came back. He stood at the edge of the work and watched Milo guide Nell along the scraper path, the iron blade biting into the chalk and clay, the spoil curling up in a dirty wave. Reuben said he meant no insult. He said it again. He said a man who works himself to death leaves a widow and orphans, not a legacy. Dr. Vale sent a note through the mail carrier. The note said he had heard about the earthwork and that stagnant air, damp bedding, and poor drainage could turn a shelter into a fever hole faster than the sun could. He said he would come check the child again in a week, whether Milo liked it or not. Klein's pressure was quieter and sharper. He visited Clara. He came on a Wednesday while Milo was cutting the East Trench. He brought a tin of peaches and a jar of honey for the children. He sat on the wagon tongue and spoke to Clara in the shade of the tent, and his voice was gentle, and that was worse than shouting. "Mrs. Wardell," he said, "I have a room behind the store. It is small, but it has a wood floor and a window, and it is cooler than this tent by 20 degrees. Your children could sleep there tonight." "At what cost?" Clara asked. "No cost for the room, but your husband's claim is not viable. You can see that. I can see that. Dr. Vale can see that. The only person who cannot see it is Milo, because pride has made him blind." He paused. "I would buy the quitclaim for a fair price, enough to get you to Topeka, find rooms, find work, start clean." "How much?" $15, an assumption of the filing debt. Clara looked at the tin of peaches. She looked at the trench her husband was cutting in the heat. She looked at Ruth, who sat inside the tent with her legs drawn up, too tired to play. "Pride has killed more children than poverty, Mrs. Wardell," Klein said. "I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because it is true." Clara told him she would think about it. Klein left the peaches and the honey and rode back to town. That evening, after the children were fed and the peaches divided into careful portions, Clara confronted Milo at the edge of the trench. The light was failing. The air was still hot, but the white glare had gone orange, and the shadows of the tent and the wagon stretched long across the turned earth. "Klein came today," she said. "I know. I saw his horse. He offered $15 in the filing debt for a quitclaim. $15 for 160 acres with a draw crossing and a live well. He offered the back room for the children, no charge." Milo drove the shovel into the trench wall. He leaned on the handle. His shirt was black with sweat, and his hands were wrapped in strips of flour sack because the blisters had opened and bled through his gloves. "Clara, if I sign that paper, we have $15 and nothing else in the world. No land, no claim, no house. $15 does not get us to Topeka. It does not get us rooms. It does not get us anything except a week in someone else's town while I look for ditch work that may not exist. And if you do not sign it, if this does not work?" Clara's voice was not angry. It was the voice of a woman who had calculated every path and found them all impassable. I will not watch you gamble the children on a theory you cannot explain, Milo. I will not watch Ruth get sicker while you pile dirt. I am not gambling, I am building. You are building something no one has seen work. Not Reuben, not Vale, not anyone. Milo was quiet for a moment. I am afraid too, he said. I'm afraid every minute I am out here, but I do not have a better answer. Do you? Clara did not answer. She turned and walked back to the tent. Inside, Milo found Ruth asleep on her cot. One hand hung over the edge, resting against a bowl of soil Clara had dampened and placed beside the bed. The child's fingers curled into the cool dirt as if reaching for something underground. Milo looked at that bowl for a long time. Then he went outside and picked up the shovel. He started the next trench section before the stars faded. The design was fixed now, rectangular trench, 20 feet by 24, enclosing the tent with working room. 4 feet deep at the base, 3 feet wide at the bottom, sloped wider at the top to a 5-foot opening. Bergit would later correct his angles. But the instinct was right. The excavated soil packed into a berm against the tent's outer walls, 3 feet high, 4 feet thick at the base, faced on the outside with cut sod blocks, and on the inside with scrap planks, willow brush, and woven grass mats to keep the mass off the canvas. Nell strained in the traces. The slip scraper bit into the chalk and jolted against buried stones. Milo walked behind it, guiding the handles, his weight pressing the blade down when the ground resisted. Each pass peeled 6 inches of soil. Each pass moved the dirt roughly 10 feet before he had to dump, turn, and cut again. By the end of the first day, he had cleared 8 feet of trench along the north wall. The spoils sat in a rough windrow beside the tent. His palms had bled through the flour sack wraps. His shoulders burned from the scraper handles. He ate cold cornbread and drank a quart of water and lay on the ground outside the tent because the inside air was too hot to breathe. By the end of the second day, the north trench was complete. 24 feet long, 4 feet deep, the walls rough but holding. He had begun packing the spoil against the tent wall, layering it with handfuls of cut grass to bind the loose soil. The berm was taking shape. From a distance, it looked like a man had driven his tent into a hillside. On the third morning, the scraper blade struck a buried limestone shelf. The impact jolted through the handles and up Milo's arms. Nell lurched forward, and the scraper skidded sideways, gouging a shallow scar across the trench floor. Milo dropped to his knees and scraped at the exposed stone with a trowel. The shelf ran east to west across the trench line, roughly 14 inches below the current depth. He could not cut through it. He could not go around it. The trench on the east side would have to be shallower by a foot unless he found a way to break the stone. He sat on the edge of the trench with his head in his hands. 3 days of work, 8 feet of finished trench, 12 more days at this pace minimum. Ruth had vomited again that morning. The well had dropped another 6 inches, and now the ground itself was fighting him. The sky above was white and flat and enormous, and the heat pressed down on everything like a hand. If you have ever been doubted while building something no one else could see yet, tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes the people closest to you are the last ones to understand. That evening, as the light went copper and the scraper sat idle beside the limestone shelf, a wagon appeared on the road traced from the north. It moved slowly, pulled by a single mule, and the figure on the seat was small and upright and unhurried. The wagon carried a basket covered with a cloth, a coil of rope, and a spade worn smooth at the handle. Bergit Stensland stopped at the edge of Milo's trench and looked down into it for a long time before she spoke. She was 57 years old, small. 5 feet and an inch, maybe less, with hands that looked too large for her frame, knuckled and scarred and brown from decades of soil and lie and wind. Her hair was white under a faded kerchief, and her face had the creased, hard look of leather left in the weather. She wore a man's work coat over a patched dress, and her boots were cracked at the soles and mended with wire. Bergit Stensland had come to Nebraska from Hardanger in 1862, a girl of 23 with a husband who died of cholera before the first winter ended. She had stayed. She had built a dugout with 2 other widows, cutting sod blocks from the prairie and stacking them in courses the way her father had stacked stone walls in Norway. She had lined the walls with woven willow and packed the cracks with clay and grass. She had built a milk cave, a shallow cellar dug into a north-facing slope, roofed with sod and planks, where cream stayed cool enough to churn in August. She had built storm banks around a schoolhouse, sod windbreaks around cattle pens, and a root cellar so well insulated that potatoes stored in October were still firm in March. She had moved to Wallace County 3 years earlier, following a niece who had married a cattle hand near Sharon Springs. The niece was dead now, too, typhoid. And Bergit lived alone in a sod house she had patched and repatched on a quarter section 6 miles north of Milo's claim. She kept a garden, a mule, 4 chickens, and a knowledge of earth construction that no one in Wallace County had thought to ask about until now. She looked at Milo's trench. She looked at the slumped berm. She looked at the tent wall where the soil had pressed the canvas inward and left a brown stain shaped like a hand. "You cut it too straight," she said. Milo climbed out of the trench. His face was coated in chalk dust, and his eyes were red from sweat. "What?" "The wall. You cut it vertical. Earth does not like pride. It wants to lean." She stepped to the edge and pointed with her spade. 1 inch back for every foot down. You cut 4 feet straight and the wall pushes out at the bottom. That is why your dirt fell." "Batter," Milo said. The word came from his railroad years, a battered slope, an angled cut. "I do not know your English word for it. I know what it looks like." She set her basket on the wagon tongue. Inside was a jar of sour milk, a cloth bundle of salt, and a round of dark rye bread. She handed the bread to Clara, who had appeared at the tent flap with Lottie on her hip. "Feed the children, then come watch." Bergit did not ask permission. She walked to the north trench wall, the section Milo had already cut, and began shaving the face with her spade. Short, precise strokes. She took an inch off the top, 2 inches at waist height, 3 at the bottom. The wall went from vertical to gently angled, and even as Milo watched, the soil stopped shedding. The battered face held itself. "How did you know to come here?" Milo asked. "The mail carrier told me a man was burying his tent. I wanted to see if he was stupid or if he understood something." She looked at him. "You're not stupid, but you do not know sod." That was the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Bergit came every morning at first light and stayed until the heat drove her into the shade of the wagon. She did not lecture. She worked beside Milo, and the lessons came through her hands. The first skill was sod cutting. Milo had been piling loose excavated soil against the tent, the same soil the scraper blade peeled from the trench. It was chalk and clay, dry and crumbling, and it would not hold a face without constant repacking. Bergit showed him how to cut sod from the prairie surface, blocks 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, sliced with the breaking plow, set shallow and then separated with the spade. The key was the root mat. Buffalo grass and blue stems sent roots 8 to 10 inches into the soil, and those roots wove the block together like the threads of a fabric. Cut with the roots intact, a sod block was a brick. Cut without them, it was a handful of dirt. She made Milo turn each block grass side down when he laid it as a retaining course along the outer face of the berm. Grass side down, the roots locked into the course below. Grass side up, they dried in the sun, and the block crumbled within days. Milo had been stacking them wrong. He tore out a section and restacked it under Bergit's eye, and the difference was immediate. The face held. The berm stopped slumping. The second skill was the air gap. Milo had planned to press brush mats directly against the tent canvas, then pack soil behind them. Bergit stopped him. She pulled a mat away from the wall and wedged a row of willow sticks between the canvas and the brush, creating a gap the width of a finger. Air that does not move is dead air, she said. Dead air is hot in summer and wet in winter. It rots canvas. It grows mold. Leave a finger's width, and the air from the trench can travel up the wall. It enters cool at the bottom and rises warm. If you seal it, you make a pocket that sweats. Milo had not thought of this. He had been thinking of mass and shade, blocking the sun, surrounding the canvas with cool earth. Bergit was thinking of movement. The trench was not just a source of cooler air, it was the bottom of a channel. Cool air entered through the intake gaps at the trench floor, traveled up through the finger-width space behind the brush mats, warmed as it rose, and exited through the ridge vent above. The tent breathed. Without the gap, it suffocated. The third skill came on the second day, when Milo had finished the intake gaps. 2 openings at the base of the berm, one on the north side and one on the east, each about 8 inches wide, and screened with a piece of burlap to keep out snakes and debris. He had placed the ridge vent on the south side, a flap propped open with a forked stick. Bergit looked at the layout and shook her head. The intake and the vent are on opposite sides. Good. But if you put the intake and the vent both on sides where wind comes, the wind pushes through too fast. It does not cool. It blows. She moved the east intake to the northeast corner, angled away from the prevailing wind. The air must be drawn, not pushed. Slow air cools. Fast air's just outside air with a door. Milo adjusted the position. He tested it by lighting a twist of dried grass and holding it at the intake gap. The smoke pulled inward, gently, steadily, not gusting. At the ridge vent, the smoke curled upward and dispersed. The system drew air the way a chimney draws smoke, but inverted. The cool source was below. The exhaust was above. On the 4th day, Bergit added a lesson Milo had not asked for. She brought a bucket of water and poured it slowly along the outer base of the berm, watching where it ran. The water found a low point on the south side and pooled against the canvas. "Rain," she said. "One storm and this pool enters your tent. You need a notch." She cut a shallow drainage channel with her spade, angling it downslope away from the berm. Water is not your enemy if you tell it where to go. It is your enemy when it decides for itself. Milo cut drainage notches on all 4 sides that afternoon. The work was brutal. Bergit could teach, but she could not do the heavy labor. That fell on Milo and Nell alone. The scraper moved earth in loads of roughly half a cubic yard, a pan of chalk and clay that weighed close to 1,000 pounds when damp. Nell pulled it. Milo guided it. Together they made 40 to 50 passes a day, and each pass left Milo's arms shaking and Nell's flanks dark with sweat. His palms had gone past blisters. The skin had torn away in patches, and the raw flesh beneath had dried and cracked and bled again. He wrapped them in strips of flour sack soaked in salt water, Bergit's remedy, and the salt burned so badly that he bit down on a stick the first time, but the wounds dried faster and did not fester. He vomited behind the wagon on the 4th morning. Heat, exhaustion, not enough water, not enough food. He hid it from Clara, but Bergit saw. She said nothing. She brought more sour milk and made him drink it before he touched the scraper. Progress was measurable. By the end of the fourth day, the north and east trenches were complete. The berm on the north side stood 3 feet high, faced with sod, backed with brush mats, and packed solid enough that Milo could stand on it without sinking. The east berm was 2/3 done. The south and west trenches were cut but not yet bermed. By the end of the 5th day, the south berm was up and the west trench was being packed. Clara had begun sweeping the lowered tent floor. Milo had dug out 8 inches of soil from inside the tent footprint, creating a sunken floor that sat below the intake level. The air that entered through the north gap now traveled across the floor and rose to the ridge vent, and even in the unfinished state, the difference was noticeable. Clara said the floor felt like shade. Not cool, but shade. Ruth still had fever spells. She sat inside the tent and watched the walls turn from canvas to a strange layered thing, brush, then gap, then canvas, with the weight of earth pressing softly from outside. The tent no longer looked like a tent. It looked like something the prairie had half swallowed. On the morning of the 6th day, Jasper Klein arrived with 2 men. They rode up from the south road, Klein on his bay horse and the 2 men, hired hands from the feed lot, on a flatbed wagon. Klein dismounted and walked to the edge of the trench and looked at the berm and the sod facing, and the intake gaps, and the drainage notches, and his expression was the expression of a man recalculating. "I need the scraper back," he said. Milo looked up from the west trench. "The week is not up." "Another customer has paid cash. The tool goes to the pay-in man." "I paid $2. That was cash." "That was a rental. This is a purchase offer. $15. The tool leaves today." Milo's hands tightened on the shovel handle. The west berm was half packed. Without the scraper, the remaining earthwork would take a week with a shovel and wheelbarrow, and he did not have a wheelbarrow. Bergit stepped out from behind the wagon, where she had been cutting sod blocks. She looked at Klein. She looked at the 2 hired men. Then she looked at Klein again. "Have you come to watch children cook, Mr. Klein?" she said. Her voice was mild. Her eyes were not. "Because that is what happens if this man does not finish." "This is a business matter, Mrs. Stensland. It does not concern you." "A child with heat sickness concerns me. A man who takes tools from a father concerns me. What business are you doing here that cannot wait 3 days?" The hired men looked uncomfortable. One of them shifted on the wagon seat and stared at his boots. The other glanced at Ruth, who had appeared at the tent flap, pale and thin and watching. Klein held for a moment. Then he smiled. The same smile from the store porch, the one that looked like patience but was not. 3 days, he said. After that, the scraper comes back, or the mayor does. He rode south without another word. Bergit watched him go. Then she turned to Milo. "Finish the west wall tonight. Do not sleep until it is packed." The unexpected help came that evening. Reuben Height appeared at the edge of the work, not on horseback, but on foot, leading his team of 2 draft horses. He did not explain why he had come. He did not apologize for his earlier doubt. He backed his team beside Nell and hitched them to the scraper and said, "Show me where you want the dirt." With 3 horses pulling, the scraper moved twice the volume. Milo guided the blade. Reuben managed the team. They worked until the stars came out and the air cooled enough that the sweat on their backs turned cold. By midnight, the west berm was packed and faced with the last of the cut sod blocks. Reuben unhitched his team. He stood beside the finished rampart and put his hand on the sod face. It was cool. Not the burning heat of exposed soil, not the dead warmth of the tent canvas, but the steady, neutral temperature of earth. that had been shaded and packed and left to settle. "I will not say it works," Reuben said, "but I will say it is not what I thought it was." He led his team east into the dark. The rampart was finished on the morning of the 6th day. Milo hung a damp flour sack across the north intake gap. The fabric darkened as the shaded trench air moved through it. Not a wind, not a breeze, but a draw. A slow, steady pull of air that had spent the night against 4 feet of packed earth and entered the tent at something close to ground temperature. Clara swept the lowered floor and spread quilts over a layer of dry grass. She set the water crock against the north berm wall where the sod face kept it shaded. She hung a second damp cloth over the east intake. She arranged the children's cots low as possible, with the mattress ticking resting almost on the dirt floor, because Bergit had told her that cool air sinks, and the lowest 6 inches of the tent would always be the coolest. The first readings were informal but specific. The store thermometer in Sharon Springs said 104 degrees in the shade of Klein's porch. At the Wardell claim, the exposed south side of the tent, the part above the berm, was too hot to press a hand against. But the shaded north face of the berm was cool enough that Lottie pressed her cheek to it and laughed. Inside the tent, a basin of water set on the floor had not turned warm after an hour. Clara touched it and touched the basin she had left on the wagon seat in direct sun. The difference was so large she called Milo in to feel it. It was not cold inside. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable. Dr. Vale returned 2 days later. He rode up, dismounted, and stood at the edge of the trench looking at the structure with the expression of a man who does not want to be impressed. He ducked inside. He knelt beside Ruth. He checked her pulse, her temperature, her eyes. He pinched the skin on the back of her hand and watched it flatten. Then he stood and breathed. He breathed again. He turned in a slow circle. "The air moves," he said. "It draws from the trench through the intake and exits at the ridge," Milo said. "Bergit designed the vent placement." Vale knelt again. He smelled the floor, checking for mold, for stagnant water, for the sour rot that turned shelters into fever holes. He smelled earth and dry grass and the faint tartness of the damp flour sack. Nothing foul. Nothing dead. "I will not approve this," he said. "I do not know enough about it to approve it, but I will tell you that the air in here is better than the air in my office in town, and my office has a window and a plank floor." He stood. "Keep the vents open. Keep the cloth damp. Keep the children low. If the air starts to smell, get them out." He paused at the tent flap. "Coolness without movement is a cellar. Coolness with movement is shelter. You seem to have movement. I will come back." He rode east. Bergit, who had been standing outside during the examination, said nothing, but she held a candle near the north intake gap and let Milo watch the flame lean inward. At the ridge vent, she lit a twist of grass, and the smoke pulled upward in a thin, steady column. The system breathed. It had been breathing since Milo hung the first damp sack. Still, doubt remained. The berm cracked in 2 places on the south side where the sun struck hardest, and Milo had to repack the cracks with wet clay and grass. A bull snake 4 feet long was found coiled in the outer trench near the east intake, and Clara killed it with a hoe before the children saw it. The well dropped another foot, and Milo calculated that at the current rate it would go dry in 3 weeks. Telegraph News at Sharon Springs reported heat deaths among railroad workers farther east, near Dodge City. The mail carrier said livestock were dropping near the rail line, cattle standing in open sun with no shade and no water, dead on their feet. The heat was not finished. The heat had not even started. Ruth asked one evening, while Milo was repacking the south berm crack, whether the tent would stay cool if the wind stopped completely. No adult answered her immediately. Clara looked at Milo. Milo looked at the ridge vent, where the smoke twist still pulled upward, but barely. The draw depended on temperature difference between the trench air and the tent air. As long as the sun heated the upper tent, the hot air rose and pulled cooler air in from below. But on a still night, when the temperatures equalized, the draw would slow. And if it stopped, the tent became what Vale had feared, a cellar without movement. Milo did not answer Ruth's question. He walked to the trench and pressed his hand against the wall, 4 feet down. It was cool. He pressed his other hand to the berm face, also cool. The earth was holding its temperature. The question was whether it would hold it long enough. The heat arrived on a Tuesday. It did not build. It landed. The morning opened at 91 degrees before the sun cleared the horizon, and by 9 the air had the weight and taste of something breathed through cloth. The sky was not blue. It was white, a flat metallic white that pressed down on the prairie like a lid. No wind, no cloud, no bird. By noon, the store thermometer in Sharon Springs read 110 in the shade of the porch. The exposed thermometer on the feedlot fence post, the one the cattle hands used, read 118 in direct sun. The blacksmith closed his forge because the additional heat was unbearable. The saloons filled with men who sat without drinking because their mouths were too dry to swallow. Dogs crawled under porches and did not come out. At the Wardell claim, the canvas above the berm, the upper third of the tent that rose above the earthwork, blazed in the sun. Milo touched it and pulled his hand back. The canvas was hot enough to scald. The unburied portion was defeating the whole design. The berm cooled the lower walls. The trench cooled the intake air, but the exposed ridge and upper canvas radiated heat downward into the space like a stove lid over a pot. Bergit arrived before Milo had finished thinking. She looked at the tent and said, "The second fly." Milo had a second piece of canvas, a tarpaulin he had used to cover the wagon bed during the move from Illinois. It was 12 feet by 14, stained and patched, but intact. Bergit told him to rig a ridge rope 6 inches above the tent peak and drape the tarp over it, leaving a hand-width air gap between the tarp and the tent roof. The tarp would catch the sun. The air gap would insulate. The tent canvas below would sit in shade. They rigged it in the worst of the heat, working on top of the berm, and the sun struck the back of Milo's neck like a brand. Clara handed up the canvas from below. Bergit tied the ridge rope with knots Milo had never seen, simple, tight, and quick to release. By 2 in the afternoon, the second fly was up. The difference was immediate. The upper canvas, shaded by the tarp, dropped from scalding to merely hot. The air inside the tent, which had been climbing toward 100 degrees at head height, stabilized. At floor level, where the children lay on quilts, the air was in the mid-80s. Outside, the exposed thermometer read 115. Then Ruth stopped sweating. It happened in the late afternoon. Clara was wetting a cloth at the water barrel when she noticed that Ruth's face was dry, not damp from wiped sweat. Dry. Her skin was hot and flushed, and her eyes were glassy, and she was talking to the tent pole, calling it a tree, asking it where the birds were. Clara screamed Milo's name. He came in from the trench, where he had been checking the intake sacks, and found Clara holding Ruth's wrists under a stream of water from the barrel spigot. The child was not fighting. She was not responding. Her body was limp, and her pulse, when Milo pressed his fingers to her throat, was fast and thin and fluttering like a trapped bird. Heat stroke, not heat prostration. The mild kind Vale had diagnosed weeks earlier. This was the next stage. The body's cooling had failed. The The brain was swelling. Milo had seen a rail worker die of it outside Salina in 1889. The man stopped sweating, began talking nonsense, went rigid, and was dead before sundown. Dr. Vale was in town, 18 miles east. Too far. Even if Milo rode Nell flat out, it would take 2.5 hours each way, and by then Ruth would be dead or recovered or something in between that no one could predict. He had to trust the system. He had to trust Bergit. Bergit took charge. She ordered Milo to carry Ruth to the lowest point of the tent floor, the center where the sunken floor sat 8 inches below the intake level. She told Clara to soak every piece of cloth they had, shirts, flour sacks, the quilt, the ticking, and drape them over a frame of sticks above the child, creating a damp canopy that the intake air would pass through before reaching Ruth's body. She told Milo to open the second intake gap, the one on the northeast corner, full wide, removing the burlap screen entirely. More air, faster draw. No lamp, Bergit said. No bodies inside except Clara and the baby. Oren outside with me. Every person in that tent is a stove. Only the ones who must be there stay. Milo carried Oren outside. The boy clung to his neck. The air hit them like the open door of a kiln. Milo set Oren in the shade of the wagon, the only shade outside the rampart, and went back to the tent to help Clara arrange the wet cloths. Inside, the air was moving. He could feel it on his wet forearms, a slow, steady pull from the trench across the damp cloths, over Ruth's body, and up toward the ridge vent. It was not cold. It was not even cool in any comfortable sense, but it was below the killing temperature. It was breathable. It was air that a body could work with. Ruth lay on the damp quilt with her eyes half open and her lips moving without sound. Clara sat beside her, wetting cloths, wringing them, draping them over the child's wrists and neck and forehead. The water from the barrel was the temperature of the air, mid-80s. But evaporation pulled heat from the skin, and the moving air carried the moisture away and let the next cloth work. "Talk to her," Bergit said from outside. "She needs a voice she knows." Clara talked. She talked about the garden they would plant. She talked about the cottonwood trees Milo would put in the draw. She talked about the dress she would sew for Ruth's birthday, the blue one with the white collar, and how Ruth would wear it to the schoolhouse when the schoolhouse opened. She talked in a steady, low voice that did not crack, and her hands moved constantly, wetting, wringing, draping, wetting again. At the crisis midpoint, a rider appeared from the south, not Vale, not Reuben. Klein's clerk, a thin young man named Phelps who worked the store counter and ran errands. He dismounted and stood at the edge of the trench and looked at the rampart and the rigged tarpaulin and the silent tent with an expression that was half curiosity and half something else. "Mr. Klein sent me," Phelps said. "He wants to know if you have reconsidered the offer." Milo stared at him. "My daughter is inside with heat stroke." Mr. Klein said, he said it might be easier to discuss the paperwork before circumstances make it more difficult, before tragedy makes paperwork harder. That was Klein's language, filtered through a clerk too young to understand what he was delivering. Milo took a step toward Phelps. Clara's voice came from inside the tent, sharp and clear. "Milo!" He stopped. Clara appeared at the tent flap. She was holding the quitclaim document that Klein had left during his visit weeks earlier, the unsigned paper, still folded, still clean. She held it up so Phelps could see it. Then she tore it in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces fall into the trench. "Tell Mr. Klein," Clara said, "that Mrs. Wardell sends her answer." Phelps left without another word. The afternoon stretched. The heat outside built past 115 and held there. Milo checked the berm every hour. pressing his palms to the sod face, checking the drainage notches, repacking cracks where the sun had dried the clay. Chickens that had been scratching near the wagon lay on their sides in the dust, beaks open, panting. 2 of them died before sunset. Milo carried their bodies to the draw and did not tell the children. In town, people were suffering. The telegraph operator told the mail carrier, who told Milo later, that 3 railroad workers had collapsed at the section house east of Sharon Springs. A boy from a neighboring claim, the Fenster boy, 12 years old, was carried to town on a board with heat prostration so severe that his skin was the color of brick. Reuben Height's wife, Alma, collapsed after cooking supper in their frame lean-to, where the tarred roof and thin walls made the interior 10 degrees hotter than the outside shade. Reuben carried her to the yard and laid her in the grass and poured water over her dress. Klein's own store was failing. The tarred flat roof absorbed every degree of sun and held it. The stacked lumber along the west wall blocked what little air might have moved. By afternoon, the store interior was over 120 degrees, and Klein closed early and sat on the porch in the shade, fanning himself with a newspaper that was too hot to read. The contrast was not triumphant. Milo did not stand on his berm and survey the suffering town with satisfaction. He was inside the tent, on his knees beside his daughter, watching the wet cloths steam dry in the moving air and replacing them before they lost their cool. He was counting Ruth's breaths. He was timing the intervals between her confused words, watching for the signs Bergit had told him to watch for: rigidity, seizure, silence. At dusk, a section of trench wall on the west side slumped. Nell, tied near the wagon, had shifted during the afternoon and kicked loose a retaining sod block at the trench edge. The block fell, and the wall behind it sagged, and a cascade of dry soil slid into the trench and partially blocked the drainage notch. Milo had to go outside. The air struck him like a wall. It was past sundown, but the ground was still radiating, and the temperature at chest height was over 100 degrees. He stumbled to the west trench, dizzy, his vision blurring at the edges. The slump was 2 feet wide and a foot deep. Not catastrophic, but the drainage notch was blocked, and if rain came, water would pool against the tent wall. From inside the tent, Bergit's voice: "Milo, listen. Do not dig the hole wider. Repack the pressure path. Set the sod block back first, then tamp behind it. If you dig, you weaken the wall above, and the whole section goes." Milo found the fallen sod block in the trench bottom. It had cracked in 2 pieces. He fitted the larger piece back against the wall face, braced it with a plank Bergit slid out through the intake gap, and tamped loose soil behind it with the flat of the shovel. He packed it in layers, 3 inches of soil, 5 blows with the tamper, 3 more inches, 5 more blows. His arms trembled. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he could not wipe it because his hands were caked with clay. Bergit called instructions from inside. She could not see the wall, but she could hear the tamping, and she knew, from 40 years of building with earth, what each sound meant. Harder at the base, softer at the top. You're packing it too tight at the crown. The soil needs to settle, not resist. If you are invested in whether this family makes it through the night, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next is something no one in Wallace County expected. Milo finished the repair as the stars came out. He crawled back into the tent and lay on the floor beside Ruth's cot, breathing the moving air, feeling the packed earth coolness against his back through the quilt. Ruth was still confused. She called for water and then forgot she had asked. Clara wet her lips and pressed a damp cloth to the back of her neck and talked about the blue dress. The hours passed. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2. At 3, Clara woke Milo by touching his shoulder. He came up fast, expecting the worst. Ruth was sweating. Her forehead was damp. Her cheeks were flushed but wet. Her body had found its cooling again. The system that had failed in the afternoon had restarted. The moving air, the damp cloths, the lowered floor, the earth-cooled intake. Together they had given Ruth's body what the open prairie could not, a temperature low enough for the human cooling system to function. Clara held her hand against Ruth's forehead and wept without sound. Milo went outside. The air was still warm, but the worst of the heat had broken into something merely brutal. He pressed his palms to the berm face. Cool. The sod blocks, the packed earth, the shaded trench. They had held their temperature through the worst afternoon in 50 years. The earth had done what canvas and wood and tar could not. It had stayed cool because it was massive and shaded and connected to the ground that went down and down into a place where the sun had never reached. Dr. Vale arrived after midnight. He had been in town all day treating the railroad workers and the fenster boy and two elderly men who had collapsed in their homes. He was exhausted. His coat was stained with sweat, and his hands shook when he opened his bag. He had expected to find a dead child, or a dying one. He ducked into the tent. He knelt beside Ruth. He checked her pulse. Steady, slow, normal. He checked her skin, damp, cooling, responsive. He lifted her eyelid, and the pupil contracted in the lamplight. He pinched the skin on her hand, and it flattened immediately. He sat back on his heels and breathed. Then he looked around the tent, at the brush mats along the walls, at the damp cloths hanging from the frame, at the ridge vent where a thin curl of warm air was still rising, at the floor, which was cooler than any floor he had stood on that day, cooler than his office, cooler than the store, cooler than the schoolhouse or the saloon or any building in Sharon Springs. He touched the berm wall through the brush mat. Cool, not cold, not miraculous, but cool in the way that a well house is cool, or a root cellar, or a cave. The passive, massive, indifferent coolness of earth that does not care what the sky is doing. How much earth is around this? He whispered. 4 feet of trench, 3 feet of berm, sod-faced on the outside, brush-gapped on the inside. 2 intakes, 1 vent, drainage on all 4 sides. Milo's voice was flat with exhaustion. Bergit designed the airflow. Vale was quiet for a long time. He was a man who had been right about many things and wrong about this one, and he was old enough and honest enough to know the difference. I was wrong, he said. He said it to the tent, not to Milo. I said canvas was a lantern chimney. You turned it into a chimney that draws cold instead of heat. He stood, his knees cracked. He looked at Ruth, sleeping, sweating, alive. Keep the water moving. Keep the vents open. I will come back tomorrow. He paused at the tent flap. You should teach this, Wardell, before the next one comes. He rode into the dark, and the Rampart breathed, and the family slept inside the coolest room in Wallace County. Morning brought witnesses. Reuben Height arrived first. He came on foot, leading his team, his face drawn, and his shirt dark with sweat that had not dried overnight. Alma was better. She had slept in the yard on wet grass while Reuben fanned her with a board, but she was still weak, still dizzy, still unable to stand without listing to one side. Reuben had spent the night beside her, counting her breaths, and now he stood at the edge of Milo's trench and looked at the rampart and the double-fly canvas and the sod-faced berm with the expression of a man who is seeing something for the second time and understanding it for the first. How is Ruth? He asked. Sweating? Sleeping. Pulse is steady. Reuben nodded. He stepped into the trench and put his hand on the wall. He held it there. He looked at Milo. This is cool, he said. Not a question. 4 feet down, the soil holds nighttime temperature into the afternoon. The berm shades the canvas. The trench feeds cooler air through the intake. It rises and exits the ridge. And it held through yesterday? Through yesterday. Through the night. It is holding now. Reuben withdrew his hand and wiped it on his trousers. He did not apologize. He did not take back what he had said about mud ovens, or wasted strength, or jobs too big for one man. He said, "How deep do I need to cut my trench?" That was his conversion, not a speech, a question. A man who had watched his wife collapse in a building that could not protect her, standing in a trench that could, asking how to build one. Milo told him. 4 feet minimum, wider at the top than the bottom, 1 inch of batter per foot, sod blocks grass side down on the outer face, brush mats with a finger-width gap on the inner face, intake low and on the side away from prevailing wind, vent high and on the opposite side, drainage notches leading downslope on all 4 corners. Reuben listened. He did not write it down. He repeated the measurements once, nodded, and unhitched his team. "I will start tonight when it cools," he said. "My lean-to has a west wall that bakes until midnight. If I berm that wall and trench the north side, that is enough?" "It is a start. Bank the hottest wall first. You can do the rest in sections." Reuben led his team east. He had not said thank you. He did not need to. The question was the thanks. Dr. Vale returned before noon. He rode up slowly, dismounted with the care of a man whose joints had stiffened overnight, and ducked into the tent without greeting Milo. He checked Ruth first, pulse, skin, eyes, the pinch test on her hand. He listened to her chest with his ear pressed to her back. Then he checked Lottie, who was crawling on the cool floor and babbling at Orrin. Then he checked Clara, who had not slept in 30 hours, and whose hands were raw from wringing wet cloths. "The child is recovering," he said. He said it to Clara, not to Milo. "The fever broke cleanly. There's no sign of brain involvement. She'll be weak for a week. Keep her low. Keep her cool. Keep her drinking." He paused. "You saved her life last night, Mrs. Wardell. The cloths, the water, the positioning. That was good field medicine." Clara nodded. She was too tired to cry again. Vale stepped outside and found Milo repairing a crack in the south berm where the morning sun had already begun drying the exposed clay. Bergit was beside him, mixing a paste of wet soil and shredded grass to fill the crack. "Show me the airflow," Vale said. Milo walked him through the system. He started at the north intake, where the damp flour sack hung in the gap. He lit a twist of grass and held it near the opening. The smoke pulled inward. They followed the air's path, through the gap, along the finger-width channel behind the brush mats, across the lowered floor, and up to the ridge vent, where the smoke curled out and dispersed. Vale watched the smoke at every point. He timed its movement. He estimated the airspeed, slow, maybe a foot per second, nothing a person would feel as a breeze, but enough to carry moisture and heat upward and out. "I told you this was a lantern chimney," Vale said. "Canvas holding heat in, cooking the people inside." He touched the berm wall. "You turn the chimney upside down. The heat still rises and leaves, but the replacement air comes from the earth instead of the sky." "Bergit taught me the vent placement," Milo said. "Without the draw, the cool air sits on the floor and the hot air sits above it, and nothing moves. The vent is what makes it a system instead of a pit." Vale turned to Bergit. "Mrs. Stensland, where did you learn this?" "Nebraska," Bergit said. 1864. We built a milk cave into a north slope, and the cream stayed cold in August. The principle is the same. Earth does not change its mind the way air does." Vale nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and produced the same folded paper he had given Milo weeks earlier, the one that said heat prostration. He unfolded it, crossed out what he had written, and wrote something new underneath. He handed it to Milo. The new line read, Earth-sheltered, ventilated enclosure, effective. That is not an official medical endorsement, Vale said. That is one man's observation. But if you show this to the families who come asking, it may help. He paused. I was right about bad air. I was wrong about your trench. You made the earth breathe, Wardell. I did not think that was possible. He mounted his horse. Teach it before the next hot spell. People are dying in rooms that are hotter than the outdoors, and they do not understand why. Within 2 days, 3 families came to the Wardell claim asking questions. The first was a woman named Delia Chalk, whose husband had been hauling freight to Dodge City and would not return for a week. She had 4 children in a wagon cover, stretched over a frame of cedar poles, and the youngest, a boy of 2, had stopped eating in the heat. She stood at the edge of Milo's trench and stared at the structure and said she had never seen anything like it. Milo showed her the system. He drew the plan in the dust with a stick, the same dust where Bergit had corrected his trench angles days earlier. He drew the trench, the berm, the sod face, the brush gap, the intakes, the vent. He explained the batter, 1 inch per foot, and the sod block orientation and the drainage notches. He explained the second fly and the damp cloth at the intake. Delia Chalk did not have a slip scraper or a team of horses. She had a shovel and her own 2 hands. You do not need to build the full rampart, Milo said. Bank the west wall of your wagon cover. That is the wall that bakes. Cut a trench along the outside, 2 feet deep, pile the earth against the frame, and face it with cut sod. Open a gap at the bottom for air, and prop the cover at the ridge for a vent. It will not be as cool as this, but it will be 15 degrees cooler than what you have. Bergit cut in. 20 degrees if you shade the roof. Hang a blanket over the ridge on sticks. Leave a gap. The sun hits the blanket instead of the canvas. Delia left with the plan scratched on the back of an envelope. The second visitor was a man named Orville Teague, who had a frame shack with a tar paper roof that was peeling in the heat. His wife had fainted twice. He wanted to know if the method worked on a wooden building. Milo hesitated. He had built the rampart against canvas, which was thin and flexible. A frame wall was rigid, which meant the berm could not press against it, but it also meant you did not need the brush gap. The wall was its own separator. The principle was the same. Shade the hottest walls with mass, create a cool air intake at the base, vent at the top. Bergit answered before Milo finished thinking. Pile sod against the west wall and the south wall. Wet the sod. Cut a trench outside if you have the strength, but even without the trench, the sod mass will absorb heat that would have gone through the wall. Open your highest window on the east side and hang a wet cloth in the lowest window on the north side. The air will draw. Teague took notes on the back of a feed receipt and rode home. The third visitor was Dr. Vale's clerk, a young man who had studied 2 years of medicine in St. Louis before his money ran out. Vale had sent him to measure the temperature difference with a proper thermometer. He spent an hour inside the tent, recording readings at floor level, waist level, and ceiling level, then walked outside and took readings in full sun, in the shade of the wagon, and in the trench at 4 feet down. The numbers confirmed what Clara's hands had already told her. In the worst afternoon heat, with the exposed thermometer reading 115 in the sun and 106 in the shade, the tent interior at floor level read 84 degrees, at waist height 91, at the ridge vent 98. The trench floor read 79, The berm face on the shaded north side read 81, a difference of 20 to 30 degrees between the exposed sun and the tent floor. Not because of magic, because shade, mass, earth contact, and ventilation worked together. The earth absorbed the day's heat slowly and released it slowly. The trench air, shaded and in contact with 4 feet of packed soil, entered the tent cooler than the outside air. The vent pulled the warmed air out. The cycle repeated all day without fuel, without ice, without machinery. Vale's clerk wrote the numbers in a leather-bound book and took them back to town. Klein heard the numbers. He said nothing publicly, but he raised the price of nails by 2 cents a pound, canvas by 15 cents a yard, and shovel handles by a dime each. If people were going to dig instead of buy lumber, he would make the digging more expensive. Clara noticed the price changes when she went to town for salt. She told Milo. Milo said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "He is not finished," Clara said. "No," Milo said, "but neither are we." Bergit came every day now. She arrived at first light on her mule, carrying food, sour milk, dark bread, salt pork, whatever her garden and pantry provided, and she stayed until the heat drove her into the shade of the tent, where she sat on a stool and directed improvements from inside. The relationship had changed. In the first days, Bergit had been the teacher and Milo the student. She corrected him. She stopped his mistakes before they became failures. She redesigned his vent placement and his sod block orientation and his drainage and his air gaps. Milo listened because he had no choice and because she was right. Now they worked as partners. Milo's ditch hand instincts, his understanding of soil movement, grade, drainage, and compaction merged with Bergit's sod builder knowledge. He knew how to move earth efficiently. She knew how to make it stay. He understood water as a drainage problem. She understood it as a cooling tool. Together, they improved the design in ways neither would have found alone. The first improvement was a cool pantry. Milo dug a recess into the north trench wall, 3 feet deep, 2 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and lined it with sod blocks and a plank shelf. The recess sat below grade on 3 sides, with the open face toward the trench. Shaded, earth-enclosed, and ventilated by the trench air, it stayed 10 degrees cooler than the tent floor. Clara stored the water crock there, and the butter and the milk. The butter did not melt. It softened, but it held its shape. In Wallace County in July, that was a miracle. The second improvement was a reed screen over the intake gap. Dust and insects had been entering with the cool air, coating the wet flour sacks and settling on the children's bedding. Bergit wove a screen from dried cattail reeds gathered in the draw, and the screen filtered the intake air without blocking it. The smoke test still showed a steady draw. The air was cleaner. The third improvement was a second shaded air gap above the tent. The original double fly, the tarpaulin draped over the ridge rope, worked, but on the hottest afternoons, the air between the tarp and the tent canvas heated up and turned stagnant. Milo propped the tarp edges higher, creating a 6-inch opening on the east and west sides. Hot air escaped from under the tarp. Cooler air replaced it. The upper canvas temperature dropped another 5 degrees. In the evenings, when the work was done and the tent breathed its slow, cool breath, Bergit and Milo sat in the shade of the berm and talked. Not about technique, about the years behind them. Bergit told him about Hardanger, the steep farms above the fjord, the stone walls her father built without mortar, the snow that came in October and did not leave until May. She told him about Torbjörn, her husband, who had wanted to be a school teacher but could not afford the training, and who had signed them onto the emigrant ship instead, because America was supposed to be the place where a man could become what he wanted. Torbjörn died 11 weeks after they landed. The cholera took him in 2 days. I built the dugout because I had no man and no money and no passage home, she said. I did not build it because I was brave. I built it because the other choice was to freeze. Milo understood that. He had not built the rampart because he was clever or innovative. He had built it because every other door was closed and the only material left was the ground under his feet. Bergit coughed. She had been coughing for 2 days. A dry, deep cough that came from the base of her chest and left her breathless. She waved off Clara's concern. She said it was dust. She said it was the dry air. She drank water and coughed again, and the cough left a fine mist on her handkerchief that she folded away before anyone could see. Clara saw. On a teaching day at the Teague place, Bergit was showing Orville's wife how to position a wet cloth at the intake gap of their newly bermed shack. Bergit stopped speaking mid-sentence. She put her hand on the wall and stood very still. Then she sat down on the ground. Then she lay on her side in the dust beside the sod berm and closed her eyes. Milo carried her to the wagon. Her body was light, lighter than Ruth, lighter than Oren, and her skin was hot but not with heat stroke. This was fever. This was something inside. Clara made a bed for her inside the Rampart tent, on the coolest part of the floor, with the intake air moving across her body. Bergit opened her eyes and said, "Not here. I'm taking up space." "You are taking up exactly the space you need," Clara said. Dr. Vale came that evening. He listened to Bergit's chest for a long time. He pressed on her abdomen. He checked her eyes and the color of her tongue and the spots on her handkerchief, which Clara had kept. He stepped outside and spoke to Milo quietly. "Her lungs are failing. The blood in the handkerchief is not from coughing hard. It is from tissue breaking down. This has been coming for months, maybe longer. The heat did not cause it, but it will not help." "How long?" Milo asked. "Days, maybe a week. I cannot say." Milo went back inside. Bergit was propped on a rolled quilt, her breathing shallow and quick. She looked at him and said, "Stop staring. Come sit. I want to tell you about the schoolhouse." She had been thinking about the schoolhouse in Sharon Springs. It was a single-room frame building with a shingled roof and windows on the east and south sides. It served as the church, the meeting hall, the polling place, and the only public shelter in town. On the worst heat days, families with no other refuge went there. But the building was poorly ventilated. The west wall caught afternoon sun for 6 hours, and the shingled roof trapped heat the way a Dutch oven traps heat under a lid. "If the next hot spell comes and people go to the schoolhouse, they will cook," Bergit said. "The same way your tent was cooking your children. The same way Klein's store cooks him. The building needs a Bermed west wall, a vent in the roof, an intake near the foundation. You know how to do this now." "I know how to do it for a tent. A building is different." "A building is bigger and harder. The principle is the same. Mass against the hot wall. Air in low, air out high. The earth does not care if the wall is canvas or wood." She coughed, and this time the cough was wet, and she pressed the handkerchief to her mouth, and when she pulled it away there was red on the white cloth. "Listen to the ground before you tell it what to do," she said. "You are a good builder, Milo, but you are in a hurry and the earth is not. Feel the soil before you cut it. Smell it. If it smells like rain, it has water in it and it will hold. If it smells like dust, it is dry and it will crack. You cannot build with dust. You have to wait for the ground to be ready." She closed her eyes. 2 days later, in the early morning, with the intake air moving across the tent floor and the children sleeping and Clara sitting beside her, Bergit Stensland stopped breathing. There was no struggle. There was no final word. Her chest rose and fell and did not rise again. Clara held her hand for a long time after. Milo stood outside in the trench, his back against the berm wall, looking at nothing. The sod blocks Bergit had taught him to cut were cool against his shoulders. The air moving through the intake gap she had redesigned stirred the hem of his shirt. Everything around him, the berm, the trench, the drainage notches, the reed screen, the double fly, the cool pantry, carried her hand in it. She had taught him to build a system that breathed, and now she had stopped breathing, and the system went on without her because that was what she had designed it to do. They buried her on a rise east of the draw, where the wind moved through the buffalo grass and the school children would be able to see the place from the road. Milo dug the grave himself. He cut it with batter, 1 inch per foot, because that was what she had taught him, and because he did not know how else to honor her except by building the way she had shown him. The secondary crisis came 8 days later, before the grief had settled. A second heat wave rolled across the western Kansas plains. Not as extreme as the first. The exposed thermometer read 111 instead of 115 sound, but sustained. 3 days of white sky and dead air, and temperatures above 105 from dawn to dusk. The ground, which had barely cooled from the first wave, heated again faster this time. Livestock suffered. Wells dropped. The road between Sharon Springs and the rail spur shimmered so violently that the mail carrier said he saw buildings that were not there. The families who had burned their shelters, Reuben with his west wall, Delia Chalk with her wagon cover, Orville Teague with his frame shack, held. Not comfortably, but they held. The families who had not were in trouble. On the second day, a community prayer meeting was called at the schoolhouse. 12 families came, including women with small children and 2 elderly men who could not survive another day in their tin-roofed claim shacks. The schoolhouse was the only public building large enough to hold them. It was also, as Bergit had predicted, a trap. By noon, the west wall of the schoolhouse was radiating heat into the room. The shingled roof, dark, unshaded, pitched low, caught every degree of sun and held it. The 2 east side windows provided some cross ventilation when the air moved, but on a still day, the air did not move. 43 people, men, women, children, 2 infants, sat in a room that was climbing past 105 degrees and rising. The school teacher, a young woman named Ada Prewitt, sent a boy running to Milo's claim. Milo arrived on Nell in 40 minutes. He dismounted, walked inside, and stopped. The air hit him like the inside of the tent before the rampart, thick, still, tasting of sweat and wood and panic. Children were lying on the floor. The 2 elderly men sat against the east wall with their shirts open and their eyes half closed. A woman was fanning an infant with a hymn book. The windows were open, but nothing came through them. He turned around and walked outside and looked at the building the way Bergit would have looked at it. West wall catching 6 hours of afternoon sun. No shade. Roof dark and low. Windows only on east and south. No vent, no intake. The building was designed for winter, to hold heat in. In summer, it held heat in just as well, and the people inside were the fuel. He did not have days. He did not have a slip scraper, or a team of horses, or cut sod blocks, or the tools for a proper rampart. He had an afternoon, a shovel, and whatever hands he could organize. "I need every man outside," he said. "Now." 7 men came out, including Reuben and 2 men Milo did not know. They stood in the white sun and blinked at him. "We are going to trench the west wall," Milo said. 2 feet deep, 18 inches wide, the length of the building. The spoil goes against the wall. Women soak sheets and blankets and hang them in the north windows. Every window on the north side gets a wet cloth. Boys carry water from the pump and keep the cloths wet. Someone needs to open the roof. Open the roof? one of the men said. "There is a ventilation hatch at the ridge. It has been nailed shut since last winter. Pry it open. Hot air rises. If you give it a way out, it leaves. Right now it is sitting on the ceiling and pressing down." Reuben was already moving. He took 2 men to the west wall, and they began cutting a shallow trench with shovels and a mattock borrowed from the blacksmith's shed. The soil here was harder than at Milo's claim, packed clay with gravel, but the trench did not need to be deep. 2 feet would shade the base of the wall and create a pocket of cooler air against the foundation. The women organized inside. Sheets came down from the loft, soaked in buckets, and hung across the north windows. The water dripped onto the sill and ran down the wall, and the air that passed through the wet fabric entered the room measurably cooler. Not comfortable, but measurably cooler. Milo found the ridge vent, a hinged hatch 3 feet long at the peak of the roof, nailed shut with 4 penny nails that had rusted into the wood. He climbed onto the roof, pried it open with a claw hammer, and propped it with a shingle. The effect was immediate. A column of hot air rose from the hatch like smoke from a chimney. Inside, the oppressive ceiling weight lifted. The air began to stratify, hotter at the top, less hot at the bottom, with a slow movement from the wet north windows toward the open ridge. Klein arrived at the schoolhouse at 2 in the afternoon. He had not come to help. He stood on the road and watched the men trenching, his expression hard and set. "Wardell," he called, "who authorized this excavation? This is county property." Milo did not stop digging. "There are 43 people inside, Jasper. 2 of them are infants." "I have canvas for shade in my store. Proper canvas, not dirt." "At what price?" "Standard price." "No one in that building can pay your standard price. They came because they had nowhere else to go." Reuben straightened from the trench. His face was streaked with clay. "Klein, if you have canvas, bring it. If you have come to argue, leave. There are children in there." Klein stood on the road for a full minute. Then he turned and walked back to his store. He did not bring canvas. By 4 in the afternoon, the west wall trench was complete, and the spoil was piled against the foundation. Milo had the boys carry buckets of water and soak the piled earth. The wet soil against the shaded wall dropped the surface temperature of the boards by 15 degrees. Inside, the floor temperature had fallen from 105 to 93. The wet sheets at the north windows were being changed every 20 minutes as they dried. The ridge vent was pulling a steady column of warm air. Ada Prewitt walked through the room, checking each family. The elderly men were sitting upright. The infants were sleeping. The children were no longer lying flat on the floor. They had risen to their knees, then their feet, then begun moving again, the way children do when the pressure lets up. If this story reminds you why the things people build with their hands can save more lives than the things people sell from shelves, share it with someone who needs to hear it. At dusk, the temperature dropped below 100. The families began leaving, carrying children, rolling wet sheets, stepping over the trench on their way to wagons. Several women stopped to touch the bermed west wall. One of them asked Milo how deep a trench needed to be for a claim shack. Another asked about the ridge vent, how large, how high, which direction to orient it. Milo answered every question. He drew plans in the dust. He corrected a man who wanted to seal the intake to keep out bugs. He told a woman to hang the wet cloth on the side away from the wind, not facing it. Bergit's voice was in every answer. Feel the soil before you cut it. Slow air cools. The earth does not care if the wall is canvas or wood. Reuben stood beside him as the last wagon pulled away. "You did not learn this from a book," he said. "I learned it from a woman who built a milk cave in Nebraska in 1864, Milo said. "She died last week in my tent, the coolest room in the county, and it could not save her." Reuben was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It saved the people she built it for." That is what she would have said. Milo looked at the schoolhouse. The ridge vent was still open. The wet sheets were drying in the evening air. The trench along the west wall was a dark line in the pale soil, and the piled earth against the foundation looked like the beginning of something that would be there for a long time. Inside Klein's store, 200 yards down the road, the tarred flat roof was still radiating the day's heat. The stacked lumber along the west wall was still blocking the air. The interior was still over 100 degrees at sunset. Klein's own building, the largest and most expensive in Sharon Springs, was the hottest room in town. The Rampart had held. The schoolhouse had held. Klein's pride had not. The days after the schoolhouse changed the shape of things in Wallace County. It was not sudden. There was no announcement, no meeting called, no proclamation nailed to Klein's store porch. What happened was quieter than that. Families who had been inside the schoolhouse during the second heat wave went home and looked at their buildings differently. They looked at the west walls that caught afternoon sun. They looked at the roofs that held heat past midnight. They looked at the sealed windows and the absent vents and the tarred surfaces that absorbed every degree the sky threw at them, and they thought about the trench Milo had cut in an afternoon that dropped the temperature inside by 12 degrees. Within a week, Reuben Height had finished berming the west wall of his lean-to. He had cut a trench 2 feet deep and piled the spoil against the boards and faced it with sod blocks cut from his own pasture. He had opened a vent hole in the gable end by removing 2 boards and hanging a flour sack over the gap. His wife Alma, still recovering, sat inside and said the air moved for the first time since they had built the structure. Delia Chalk, working alone while her husband hauled freight, had bermed her wagon cover on 3 sides. She could not manage the full depth. She had dug 18 inches instead of 4 feet. But even the shallow berm and a wet cloth at the intake dropped the temperature enough that her 2-year-old started eating again. Orville Teague, following Bergit's instructions delivered before she died, had bermed his frame shack and opened a ridge vent. His wife told Clara at the pump that the bedroom, which had been unbearable at night, was now merely warm. She could sleep. Her children could sleep. That word, sleep, carried more weight than any temperature measurement Vale's clerk could record. 2 families Milo had never met rode out to the claim and asked to see the Rampart. They walked the trench. They touched the sod face. They knelt at the intake and felt the air draw inward. One of them, a German settler named Fehrenbach, who spoke little English, drew the layout on a piece of hide with a charcoal stick and took it home. He bermed his dugout's exposed south wall within 3 days. Milo taught every one of them. He drew the plan in the dust. He showed the trench angle and the sod orientation and the intake placement and the vent position. He corrected their mistakes before they made them. He told them what Bergit had told him, 1 inch of batter per foot. Grass side down. Leave the air gap. Slow air cools. He insisted on teaching the women, too. This was Bergit's instruction, delivered during her last days, and Milo followed it without question. The women would be inside the shelters with the children. They would be the ones watching for the signs, the dry skin, the glassy eyes, the slurred speech that meant the cooling had failed. They needed to understand the system as well as the men who built it. Clara became his partner in this. She taught the mothers what she had learned during Ruth's crisis. Keep the children low, keep the cloths wet, rotate them before they dry, position the sickest person nearest the intake, keep unnecessary bodies out. She taught water rationing, how much to drink, how much to use for cooling, how to prioritize. She taught bedding height. Cots off the ground caught warmer air. Pallets on the floor stayed in the coolest layer. She taught the smell test Bergit had taught her. If the air inside smelled stale or sour, The vents were blocked and the system had stopped breathing. Milo handled earth and structure. Clara handled the lived interior. Between them, they covered every part of the method, and the families who learned from both of them fared better than the families who learned from only one. The measurable results accumulated. Dr. Vale, who had begun keeping careful records after the first heat wave, noted that among the 9 families who adopted some version of the earth bank method, full ramparts, partial berms, trenched walls, vented shelters, there were 0 cases of severe heat prostration during the second and third waves. Among the families who had not, there were 11 cases, including 2 that required him to stay overnight. He wrote this in his medical ledger. He did not publish it. He did not send it to a journal or a board of health. He wrote it in a leather-bound book in careful script and showed it to Milo and said, "This is not proof. This is 1 county in 1 summer, but it is something." It was enough. Klein's store was the last holdout. Through July and into August, as families bermed and trenched and vented their shelters across the county, Klein's building sat on the main road like a monument to everything the earth bank method was designed to defeat. Tarred flat roof, black in the sun. Stacked lumber against the west wall, blocking airflow and absorbing heat. No vent, no intake, no shade on the hottest face. The interior climbed past 110 degrees every afternoon and did not drop below 95 until well past midnight. Klein worked through it. He was stubborn in the way that men who have built something with their own hands are stubborn. The store was his achievement, his proof of competence, and the idea that a ditch hand's dirt pile worked better than his lumber building was an insult he could not absorb. He opened early, closed early, and spent the worst hours on the porch, where the overhang provided shade but no relief from the radiating wall behind him. His clerk, Phelps, was not as durable. Phelps was 23, thin, and had been working the storeroom, the back room where inventory sat in stacked crates against the unshaded west wall. The storeroom had no window. It had 1 door, which opened into the main store, which was itself over 100 degrees. The storeroom was a box inside a box, and the inner box was hotter than the outer one. On the 4th day of the 3rd heat wave, Phelps collapsed among the crates. Klein found him on the floor between a barrel of nails and a stack of canvas bolts. The boy, and he was a boy despite his age, was not sweating. His skin was brick red. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when Klein shook his shoulder, Phelps said something about a freight shipment that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Klein sent a boy running for Dr. Vale. Vale arrived within the hour. He checked Phelps and told Klein that the clerk had heat stroke, not heat exhaustion, and that the difference between the two was the difference between recovery and death. He told Klein to move the boy outside into whatever shade was available and start cooling him with water. Then he said, "Send for Wardell." Klein's face went rigid. "I will not." Jasper. Vale's voice was the voice he used when he was not asking. "Your storeroom is 125 degrees. Your main store is 112. The porch is 104. There's no shade on this building that is cool enough to save this boy. The only man in this county who knows how to drop a building's temperature in an afternoon is Milo Wardell. Send for him or bury your clerk. Those are your options." Klein stood on his porch and looked at the road and the white sky and the buildings of Sharon Springs shimmering in the heat, and his pride fought his fear, and his fear won, because the boy on the floor had a mother in Hayes who had trusted Klein to look after him. "Send for Wardell," Klein said. Milo came. He rode Nell hard and arrived with his shovel across the saddle and his shirt already soaked through. He dismounted and walked into the store and felt the air, and walked into the storeroom and felt the wall, and came back out and stood on the porch beside Klein and said nothing for a moment. He did not gloat. He did not remind Klein of the grave comment, or the scraper loan, or the quit-claim offer, or the price increases, or the refusal at the schoolhouse. He saw a young man on the ground with heat stroke, and he acted. "Clear the west wall," he said. "Every crate, every barrel, every board. Get it away from the wall. The lumber is holding heat and blocking air." "That is my inventory," Klein said. "Your inventory is cooking your clerk. Move it or I will." Klein moved it. He and two men who had gathered on the porch carried the crates and barrels into the main store and stacked them against the east wall, away from the sun. The west wall was exposed, bare boards, dark with absorbed heat, radiating into the room. "Soak burlap," Milo said. "Every piece you have, hang it against the west wall inside. The water will evaporate and pull heat from the boards. Keep it wet." The men hung burlap. Clara, who had followed Milo on the wagon with the children, brought buckets of water from the pump. The wet burlap darkened against the boards, and the air in the storeroom shifted. Not dramatically, not yet, but the wall was no longer adding heat. It was losing it. "Open the back," Milo said. "There is a transom above the rear door. I can see the frame. It has been boarded over. Open it." Klein pried the boards off the transom with a claw hammer. The transom was 18 inches high and 4 feet wide, set above the door frame. When the boards came off, a column of hot air rushed out, the trapped heat of the storeroom, rising and finding an exit for the first time since the building was sealed for winter. "Now the front," Milo said. "Open every window. The air needs to enter low and exit high. The transom is your vent. The windows are your intakes." The windows opened. Air began to move, slowly, fitfully, but moving. The storeroom, which had been a sealed box, became a channel. Air entered through the low front windows, traveled across the wet burlap, absorbed moisture, carried heat, rose, and exited through the rear transom. The same principle as the Rampart, the same principle as the schoolhouse. Mass was missing. There was no berm, no trench, no earth contact, but ventilation and evaporative cooling were working. "Now the outside," Milo said. He pointed at the west wall. "I need men with shovels. We pile sod against the base of that wall, 3 feet high, tight against the boards, wet it down. The sod holds moisture and shades the foundation. It will not cool the building the way a trench would, but it will stop the wall from adding heat faster than the burlap can pull it out." Reuben was there. He had come when he heard. He took a shovel and began cutting sod from the lot behind the store. 2 other men joined him. Within an hour, a rough berm of wet sod blocks stood against the base of the west wall, 3 feet high and 2 feet thick. It was ugly. It was mud and grass piled against a man's store. But the boards behind it were no longer scalding to the touch. Inside, Phelps was lying on the floor of the main store, with wet cloths on his wrists, neck, and forehead. Vale was monitoring his pulse. Clara was managing the cloths, replacing them every few minutes as they dried, and she had positioned Phelps near the front window where the intake air was strongest. By late afternoon, Phelps was sweating again. His color was returning from brick to flush to something approaching normal. His eyes focused. He asked where he was. Vale told him he was on the floor of Klein's store, and that he was lucky to be anywhere at all. Klein watched from the doorway. He watched Milo direct the men. He watched Clara manage the cooling. He watched Reuben pile sod against his store wall. He watched his storeroom, his domain, his livelihood, his pride, transformed by dirt and water and the same principle he had mocked for weeks. When Phelps was stable, Vale stood and stretched his back and looked at Klein with an expression that contained no sympathy. "Move, Jasper," he said, "or bury him. That is what I told you, and that is what would have happened. Wardell came because a boy was dying, not because you asked." Klein said nothing for a long time. He stood in the doorway of his store and looked at the wet burlap on the wall and the sod berm outside the window and the open transom he had boarded shut and the young man on the floor who was breathing normally because a ditch hand from Illinois knew how to make a building exhale. "I called it a grave," Klein said finally. Milo looked at him. "It nearly was one before Bergit fixed it." That was all. Klein did not apologize. He did not shake Milo's hand. He did not become warm or generous or repentant. He was Jasper Klein, and he would remain Jasper Klein, and the best he could manage was the truth. 3 days later, without announcement, Klein donated a load of warped lumber to the schoolhouse. The lumber had been sitting against his west wall, heat-damaged, unsaleable. He could not sell it. He could not use it. But it could be cut into vent frames and intake screens and ridge props, and so he loaded it onto a wagon and had it delivered to the schoolhouse. And when Ada Prewitt asked who had sent it, the driver said, "Klein," and nothing more. It was enough. The summer turned. August gave way to September, and September brought rain. Not much, but enough to settle the dust and cool the air and remind the prairie that seasons still changed. The well recovered 3 feet. The grass in the draw greened at the edges. Nell gained weight on better pasture. Clara and Milo's partnership had solidified into something that neither of them named, but both of them relied on. Milo taught the building. Clara taught the living. When a family came to the claim asking for help, Milo walked the property and assessed the structure, and told them where to dig and how deep. Clara sat with the women inside and showed them the cooling techniques and the warning signs and the water management. They did not divide this work by agreement. They divided it by competence. Milo understood earth. Clara understood the bodies that lived inside it. In the evenings, after the children were down, Ruth, on her cot, stronger now, her cheeks filling out and her fainting spells gone. Orrin beside her, sleeping the hard sleep of a 5-year-old who spent his days in the dirt. Lottie in her basket near the intake where the air was coolest. Milo and Clara sat on the berm and talked. Not about the method, about the claim. About the cottonwood seedlings Milo wanted to plant in the draw, where the water table was close enough to reach roots. About the sod house he would build when he had time, not a rampart around a tent, but a proper dwelling with thick walls and a east-facing door and a vented roof and a cool pantry dug into the north side. About Ruth, who had begun drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. Pictures of the rampart, the trench, the berm, the vent flap. "She draws it from above," Clara said, "like a bird looking down." Milo looked at the drawing. His daughter had drawn the tent as a small rectangle surrounded by a larger rectangle, the trench, with lines showing the air path from intake to vent. It was not accurate. It was not to scale. But it was a system drawn by a child who understood that the air moved in a circle, in from below and out from above, and that the circle was what kept her alive. The original tent did not survive the winter. The canvas, weakened by 13 months of sun and heat and the weight of the berm pressing against the brush mats, tore along the ridge seam in an October wind. Milo and Clara had already moved into the sod house by then. A half-dug structure with walls 2 feet thick, a vented ridge, an east-facing door, and the cool pantry Milo had designed from the trench recess that Bergit had helped him build. The sod house was not beautiful. It was low and brown, and it smelled like earth after rain. But the walls held their temperature the way the berm had held its temperature, and in winter the thick sod kept the heat from the stove inside, and in summer it kept the heat from the sun outside, and the family slept in comfort that the tent had never provided. The rampart remained. Even after the tent was gone, the crescent of raised earth, the berm, the sod face, the trench now softened by rain and grass, stood in the yard like a fortification from a war no one else remembered. The children played in the trench. Nell drank from the drainage notch where rainwater collected. Visitors who came to learn the method walked the old rampart first, touching the sod blocks that Bergit had taught Milo to cut. Milo proved up the claim in 1899, 3 years of continuous residence and improvement as the Homestead Act required. The 160 acres were his, the draw, the well, the road crossing that Klein had wanted. He planted cottonwoods in the draw that first spring, 12 seedlings purchased with money Clara earned selling butter from the cool pantry. The trees grew slowly in the Kansas wind, but they grew, and within 5 years they provided the first natural shade the claim had ever known. Clara taught Ruth to read that winter using a primer borrowed from Ada Prewitt at the schoolhouse. Ruth learned quickly. She was a quiet, serious child who had nearly died in a tent at 7 and who carried that nearness with her the way some people carry a scar, not with pain, but with awareness. She knew what heat could do because she had felt it shut her body down. She knew what earth could do because she had felt it bring her body back. By the time Ruth was 12, she could explain the rampart system to any visitor who stopped at the claim. She drew it the way she had drawn it as a child, from above, like a bird. But now the drawings were accurate, scaled, annotated with measurements and notes. Milo let her teach the younger children who came with their parents. She taught them where to sit when heat came. She taught them the signs. She taught them to feel the soil before they cut it, and to listen to the ground before they told it what to do. Bergit's words passed through Milo, passed through Ruth. The knowledge moved like water through a channel, shaped by whoever carried it, but always flowing downhill to wherever it was needed. Milo never became rich. The claim produced enough, wheat in good years, cattle in dry years, butter, and garden goods in between. The sod house grew into a sodden frame addition, and then a stone-lined cellar, and then a porch facing east where Milo sat in the evenings and watched the cottonwoods throw shade across the draw. The road crossing that Klein had wanted became a county road, and traffic increased, and travelers stopped at the Wardell place because the old cool room, the pantry Milo had dug into the north bank, was known along the road as the place where a man could get a drink of water that was not warm. Reuben Height became the first neighbor to teach the method without Milo present. He bermed 2 claim shacks for families who had arrived too late in the season to build properly, and he taught them the way Milo had taught him, by drawing in the dust, by showing the angle, by insisting on the vent. He never claimed to have invented anything. He said, "Wardell showed me. Wardell's woman showed him. A Norwegian widow showed them both." That was close enough to the truth. Years later, after a different hot spell, not as severe as 1896, not the worst in 50 years, but bad enough that livestock suffered and wells dropped, and the old familiar white sky pressed down on the short grass prairie. A traveler stopped at the Wardell place and asked about the crescent of raised earth in the yard. The rampart had softened by then. Grass grew on the berm. The trench was shallow, filled in by seasons of rain and wind. But the shape was still visible, a low wall curving around a patch of ground where a tent had once stood, with drainage notches leading down slope, and the faint depression of the intake gap still legible in the sod. Milo was in his 50s by then, his hair gone gray, his hands thick with scars from decades of shovel work and sod cutting. He stood beside the old rampart and told the traveler the story, not all of it, the parts that mattered, the tent, the heat, the daughter who stopped sweating, the Norwegian widow who said the earth does not like pride, the trench that breathed, The traveler looked at the crescent of earth and said it did not look like much. Milo said it was not supposed to look like much. It was supposed to keep people alive. Those were different projects. Within one season of that first brutal summer, at least 9 families near the road trace used some version of Milo and Bergit's earth bank method. Not identical ramparts, the full design required more labor than most families could spare. But shaded trenches, bermed walls, cool pantries, and vented shelters built on the same principle. Dr. Vale recorded fewer severe heat cases among the families who adopted the method early, and by the following summer, the schoolhouse had a permanent bermed west wall and an open ridge vent that Ada Prewitt refused to let anyone nail shut. Reuben Height taught the method to 3 families Milo never met. The knowledge traveled the way all knowledge travels on a frontier, hand to hand, voice to voice, drawn in the dust and carried home on the back of an envelope. Milo and Clara remained on the claim. Their first canvas tent rotted where it fell, but the crescent of raised earth around it lasted decades. A low grass-covered wall the children climbed and travelers asked about, and old neighbors pointed to when they told the story of the summer of 1896. Bergit Stensland was buried on the rise east of the draw, where the wind moved through the buffalo grass and the cottonwood shade reached in the afternoon. The school children could see the place from the road, and some of them, the ones who had been inside the schoolhouse on the day the men dug the trench, knew whose hands had designed the system that saved them. Jasper Klein had said it first, and the county had repeated it, and the words had traveled from the store porch to the feedlot, to the pump, to every claim within 10 miles. Wardell is digging a grave around his own tent and calling it a house. The grave Klein saw became a wall. The dirt he mocked became shade. The trench that looked like surrender became the only cool breath for a child who had stopped sweating on the hottest afternoon in 50 years. And on an evening years later, after a day of heat that made the old people remember and the young people listen, Ruth Wardell, grown now, sun-browned, carrying her own child on her hip, pressed her palm against the old berm and held it there. The grass was warm. The soil beneath the grass was cool. She smiled, because the earth beneath her hand still held what Bergit had put there. The patient, massive, indifferent coolness of ground that does not care what the sky is doing. On a prairie with no trees, Milo Wardell learned that shade did not always have to fall from above. Sometimes it rose from underneath.